Chapter 13. How Sweet It Is. After breakfast the next day, Carrie came by to take me to see Grandma Belinda. I waited at the parlor window so I could rush out to meet him as soon as he pulled in the driveway. I didn't want him to have to see the look of disapproval on Grandma Olivia's face. He would surely ask me about it, and I'd have to tell him about her feelings concerning us. If there was anything I wanted to avoid at the moment, it was family turmoil, especially when it could be traced back to me. Yesterday's storm had passed, and the small vanilla scoops of clouds looked like they were melting over a powder blue sky. The instant I saw Carrie's truck, I ran out to greet him. As we drove away from Grandma Olivia's dreary home, Carrie and I remarked on how bright the sun seemed, how clean and clear the air, how beautiful the grass and the flowers. It filled me with a renewed sense of hope and reminded me when I was younger and believed life would be like one long and perfect summer day, a day just like this one. I was about to see my closest relative again. I hoped that taking her off that medication cleared her head. I couldn't wait to hug her and talk to her about everything, especially all my dreams and plans for the future. At least Belinda had time to listen, I thought. At least I had someone neither Mommy nor Grandma Olivia could take from me. As we drove up to the rest home, Carrie talked about the times his twin sister Laura had gone to see my grandmother before Uncle Jacob forbade any further visits. Carrie hadn't talked about Laura for quite a while. When I had first come to Providencetown, just pronouncing her name seemed to bring pain to his lips. "Why did Laura visit her so often, Carrie?" I asked. He thought for a moment. His memories brightened, his sea green eyes. Belinda took to Laura the first time she met her. It was as if they were recognizing something soft and loving in each other, some secret the two of them shared. No matter who else was present, Belinda directed herself only to Laura. No one knew about the first time Laura visited her up here. In fact, if I recall, my father didn't discover it was going on until the third or fourth time, and only then because some spy of Grandma Olivia's told her about the visits. She called Dad and chastised Laura for going. After all, Belinda was the black sheep of the family. We weren't supposed to mention her name, much less visit her. But Dad always had trouble forbidding Laura to do things, Carrie continued. Whenever Laura and I did something he didn't approve of, Dad would direct it mainly to me, barely looking at Laura as if she hadn't been involved at all. He never thought he let his soft spot show, but it was obvious he always thought things were my fault anyway, as if I was the one who should have known better or should have been more responsible. Laura would fly to my defense, of course, taking as much blame as she could, but Dad wouldn't hear it. He would accuse her of trying to protect me. Carrie laughed as he continued remembering. "But Dad," she would exclaim, "Carrie wasn't even there." "No matter," Dad would growl back. "He should have been there to stop you and warn you." "Once," he said, turning to me as we drove up the side of the road toward the rest home, "I took quite a beating for the both of us. He whipped me with a thick leather strap, and I had so many welts on my rear end I couldn't sit for days. I had to lie on my stomach." Laura came into my room and sat beside the bed, crying as if she felt the pain as much as I did. I tell you, I stopped feeling sorry for myself, and I didn't feel as much pain. One of my tears would draw 10 of hers, so I had to stop crying or she would drown 2 of us, he exclaimed with a laugh. Anyway, she would bike all the way here to visit Belinda, and Belinda really looked forward to her visits. From what I heard, I think Grandma Olivia was jealous. Laura never biked over to visit her. He smiled, turning to me. "Like you, Laura cared more about other people than she cared about herself, especially those who were less fortunate. Whether it was because of lack of money or lack of love. We pulled into a parking space and got out of the truck and made our way to the entrance of the home. A pretty nurse greeted us just inside the lobby. Her name tag read Mrs. Williams. I hadn't seen her before. She didn't look much older than in her late 20s. There weren't as many residents sitting there the last time I visited, but once again, my appearance, and especially Carrie's shoe, drew all their attention and quieted their conversations and interrupted their checkers and card games. I explained who we were and whom we'd come to visit, but before Mrs. Williams could respond, Mrs. Green stepped out of her office and drew our attention as she came towards us, her high heels clicking over the tile floor. "Well, it's been some time since your last visit," she said. "You led me to believe you would be here frequently," she added as if she caught me in a lie. "I've been away," I explained. She smirked and then turned to the nurse. "I'll see to them, Mrs. Williams." "Yes, ma'am," the nurse said and returned to the other residents. "Your grandmother's in the garden," she said, glancing quickly at Carrie. "This is a family member, I assume?" "Yes, he is. How is she doing?" "Quite well, actually. I should warn you that since you've been here, Mrs. Gordon's formed a friendship with one of our other residents, Mr. Mandel. The two of them spend most of their time together." Carrie smiled, but Mrs. Green didn't even acknowledge him. "It's just companionship, of course," she continued, speaking through her tight jaw, as she led us through the lobby, down the corridor, to the side door opened on the garden walkways. "But we encourage such things. We find it good for mental health to develop relationships with other residents. You talk about them as if they're some other species," I remarked. Carrie's eyes widened, surprised at my tone of voice and confrontational demeanor. But I recalled this woman's attitude about me the other times we had met, and I was sure that she was somehow on Grandma Olivia's payroll. "The elderly practically are some other species," she replied, not skipping a beat. "However, only someone who has to work with them day in and day out would understand, I'm afraid." She flashed an artificial smile at us, as I'd seen, and then nodded towards Grandma Belinda and a short, bald man sitting on a bench. He had a dark wooden cane and leaned on it as he sat. His glasses slipped down on the bridge of his nose until they tottered even to the narrow of his nostrils. He wore a blue suit jacket, but his pants of a lighter shade, almost gray actually. His tie was awkwardly knotted, with one half far longer than the other, and his socks sagged around his ankles. As we approached, I was hoping Grandma Belinda would remember me. When her face brightened, I thought she had. "Well, look who's here, Thomas. My grandnephew and grandniece," she said, and then I realized I had come with Carrie. She assumed I was Laura. "No, Grandma," I said, "it's Melanie, not Laura." "Melanie?" She looked at Carrie. "That's right, Aunt Belinda, it's your granddaughter Melanie. How are you?" She looked from him to me and blinked rapidly, even though she appeared to be struggling with her memory. She was far from as pale and drained as when I had last seen her. She looked bright, her cheeks a little rosy. She had taken care to brush her hair neatly, and she even wore a little lipstick. I saw she was holding on to Mr. Mandel's left hand. She smiled up at us, nodding. "Oh," Grandma Belinda said, "I want you two to meet Mr. Mandel. He used to be an accountant and can still add lots of numbers in his head, big numbers." "Don't exaggerate, Belinda. I'm not anything like I was," he said. "Pleased to meet you. I guess I'll let you visit with your family, Belinda," he said, rising and patting her softly on the back of her hand. "You don't have to leave, Mr. Mandel," I said, seeing the disappointment on Grandma Belinda's face. No, I have to talk to Mrs. Landau about her tax shelter investments. I promised her. You go on. Here, take my seat," he said to me. Grandma Belinda looked sadly after him as he wobbled away on his cane. Then her eyes shadowed, growing deep dark, her face turning angry and resembling Grandma Olivia's face. "I know what she's up to, asking him for advice," she muttered. She had her eyes on him the moment he came over to sit with me in the dining room. Green with envy, that one. I bet she hasn't a cent invested in anything anymore. She's just lying to get him to pay attention to her. I know that type. They can't stand to see someone else happy. Carrie laughed. I shook my head at him so he would stop. I didn't want Grandma Belinda to think he was laughing at her. Then I sat beside her, taking her hand into mine. "Grandma, don't you remember my coming to see you before?" I asked. "Do you remember our talks?" She glanced up at Carrie and then smiled at me. "Of course I remember. How are your parents?" Carrie and I exchanged looks of disappointment. Should we confront Grandma Belinda with doses of reality, or was it better to assume the roles her confused mind assigned us? "Look at me, Grandma Belinda. I'm Melanie, Haley's daughter, your granddaughter. I'm not Laura. I've come to tell you about Haley. I went to see her in California." She stared at me, pressing her lips together. Then her face turned harder, her eyes colder. "I don't have a daughter," she said. "Everyone has got to stop saying that." She turned to look after Mr. Mandel, her voice full of rage. "Now you've gone and chased Mr. Mandel away, and that Karina Lendu is going to get her claws into him. Every time I find someone tries to steal him away. My sister's no exception either." She turned back to us, her face suddenly softened again with a sweet smile. "How's your mother? You tell her I enjoyed the cookies, and if she wants to make me some more, I won't object." "Grandma," I said with more desperation, "please try to remember my other visits. I'm Melanie. Melanie, Haley's daughter." She continued to look after Mr. Mandel, and from a faraway look on her face, I could tell that she wasn't listening to me. I sighed deeply, and Carrie put his hand on my shoulder. "Grandma Olivia wanted me to come up here and give her a dose of reality. I think she knew what I would find," I said bitterly. "She was here," Grandma Belinda said, her gaze still fixed away from us. "She paid me a visit. I suppose I'm to be honored." "Who was here, Grandma?" I asked. "Her Majesty. Who else?" she said, turning back to us. "She told me Haley was dead, killed in a car accident long ago. So you see, I can't have a granddaughter. I don't have anyone. I had Mr. Mandel, but now..." "That's not true, Grandma. She lied. You have me." "Grandma," I said, "please look at me. Remember me. I visited you before, don't you remember?" I cried, practically pleading with her. She stared at me, her eyes empty. I turned to Carrie, and so did Grandma Belinda. "How's your mother, Carrie?" she asked. "Does she still do that beautiful needlework?" "Yes, she does, Aunt Belinda." He smiled and she nodded. "I used to do needlework, but my fingers are too clumsy now." "That's what happens. You get older and your fingers get clumsy." She shook her head sadly, then turned back towards Mr. Mandel and pressed her lips together so hard that the white lines of rage formed. "Just look at her beaming over there," she muttered under her breath. "He's talking and she's beaming. She doesn't have a penny invested. I told him, but men don't listen. Some other woman bats her eyelashes at them and they go chasing after them." "You understand, don't you?" she asked, turning back to me as if she just realized I was sitting beside her. She smiled. "Just look at you, look at you. You're so grown up, Laura. So grown up. Don't fall in love too fast," she warned, as she turned back to look at Mr. Mandel. "Why don't we just walk over there, and I'll pretend I need him to help you with my money too?" "Yes," she said, pleased that she'd come up with a solution to the problem. Grandma, she continued to stare at Mr. Mandel. It's no use, Melanie, Carrie said. She's not going to remember. You're just wasting time and facing more disappointment. But she's still all I have left, Carrie. I have no other family, I moaned. You've got me, he said empathetically. I thought she'd remember, I said, gazing at her wistfully. I thought we'd have some time together, but obviously Grandma Olivia made sure we wouldn't, I added. She came up here and confused her, and she did it deliberately. Let's go, Melanie. She's jealous of everything, even fragile relationships that I built with my grandmother. She just came bursting in here and swept it all away. Melanie, you're getting yourself all worked out. Come on, he urged. Do me a favor, Grandma Belinda, when I stood up. Just go over there and ask Mr. Mandel to come back. Tell him I need him right away. He'll come back to you, Grandma, I said. You're much prettier than she is. I am? She brightened again and nodded. Yes, I am prettier, aren't I? She agreed, brushing the sides of her hair with her palms. He'll see that. She's got a mole on her chin. I don't even have many wrinkles, do I? She turned to us, raising her face in the sunlight, and her eyes closed, her lips pursed like a young flirt. No, Grandma, you don't, I said and touched her cheek. She opened her eyes and gazed up at me. You look like an angel, she said. Your mother must be so proud of you. She is, Carrie said quickly, very proud. That's nice. That's the way it should be. She turned back to glare at Mr. Mandel's direction. Carrie tugged my hand and I stood up beside him. She'll be all right, he said. You're right, I said. I leaned over and gave her a kiss on the cheek, but she didn't notice. Her gaze was locked on Mr. Mandel. Bye, Grandma. I'll come back, I promise. Don't forget the cookies, she called as we started away. I looked back at her once before we left the garden. Mr. Mandel had left the other woman and was hobbling down the path toward her, and she looked very contented, very happy. Maybe it's time you started thinking more about yourself, about us, Carrie said as we left the rest home. Maybe it's time we both looked to the future and not to the past, huh? Maybe, I agreed, but I wasn't as confident as he was that the past would let us do that. I said nothing to Grandma Olivia about her visit to the rest home. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction in knowing that she had once again gotten her way. When she asked about my visit, I said it was fine and left it at that. If I was to survive in her world, I had to learn to play the game her way. For the time being, I would pretend to be a young woman she wanted me to be. The next day, as Olivia had promised, Mrs. Burton arrived at the house to begin my education in etiquette, making me feel from the start that I wasn't much better than some hick who had just arrived on these precious Cape Cod shores. I was sure it was how Grandma Olivia had described me to her. She called me down to the parlor to introduce me. Mrs. Burton, I'd like you to meet my granddaughter, Melanie, Grandma Olivia said. And I looked at the tall, thin woman who stood so straight, I thought she had a steel rod in her spine. She had very small shoulders, and the bones which pressed up sharply against the dark blue cotton dress that hung over her body in a straight line. The hem reached her ankles, and it was buttoned at the collar. Mrs. Burton said nothing but held out her hand. Hi, I offered and shook her hand quickly, backed away and looked at Grandma Olivia, whose head bobbed slightly in approval. Until school begins, Miss Burton will meet you promptly at 9 a.m. each weekday morning. After school begins, you'll arrange your schedules accordingly. For how long, I asked. For as long as it takes to turn you into a lady, Grandma Olivia replied curtly. I think I am a lady, I returned. Grandma Olivia grinned coldly and looked at Miss Burton. As you see, you have a real challenge here, Louise. I'm sure you'll do what we can. I'm sure we'll do what we can, Miss Burton said, still scrutinizing me intently. Then I'll leave you to begin. I know that you'll need all the time allotted for your lesson and then some, Grandma added and walked out of the parlor. For a moment, Miss Burton and I just looked at each other, sizing each other up like two combatants. Then she cleared her throat and took a step forward as if someone had given her a shove from behind. I can help you only if you want to be helped, she said grimly. I don't think I need to be helped, I replied honestly, since she wanted to be frank. Oh, my dear, she said, smiling and shaking her head, you most definitely need to be helped. Really? I said dryly. And how can you tell so quickly? Or are you basing everything on what my grandmother told you about me? I make my own evaluations of people. Let's simply begin with your entrance this morning. Mrs. Logan introduced you properly to me. A young person is always introduced to an older person, but you don't say hi. The very least you say is simply hello. This is acceptable in any situation, except, of course, after a formal introduction. We had a somewhat formal introduction. You should have said, hello, Mrs. Burton. I'm glad to meet you, or how do you do, Miss Burton? Furthermore, a formal verbal greeting should be accompanied by direct eye contact, which indicates that you are actually paying attention to the person you're acknowledging. You let your eyes wander to Mrs. Logan, the room, me, Mrs. Logan, back to me again, she lectured. Should I continue? She asked. I guess, I said, feeling a tight knot form in my stomach. An older person extends his or her hand first to the younger one, as I just did. But you don't take someone's hand limply, as yours is, boneless, or as if you're grasping an empty glove. Of course you don't squeeze too hard, but it should be firm, and you should look at that person directly in the eyes when you shake. Next, she continued without skipping a beat, is your dreadful posture. A person who stands erect and sits erect looks the best, looks confident, looks like someone of worth. Rounded shoulders, slouching, folding your arms across your body as you're doing right now, all this shows your sloppiness and lack of refinement. Your shoulders should be back, chin in and slightly up, abdomen and stomach in, back straight, knees relaxed. You may keep your arms at your side, relaxed as well. Now let me see you take that seat, she said, nodding towards the overstuffed chair to my left. I eyed it like a challenge of great proportions, positive that whatever I did would be wrong. Nevertheless, I stepped up to the chair, turned, looked directly at her, and sat. She laughed. What's so funny? You don't really sit like that. You would never be so stiff, nor do you flop into a chair. Sit softly and keep your knees together, she added, nodding at my legs. The only people who want to view your undergarments are degenerates. You should sit a bit sideways and keep from sprawling into the chair. These pillows are so soft that I more reason to be aware of your posture and how you appear to others in the room. I don't think I look especially sloppy, I protested. You don't look sloppy, but you don't look like a young woman of refinement, a woman of quality, stature, a woman who would attract someone of the like, she insisted. You are part of a very distinguished family now. You have the responsibility to be distinguished yourself, and sitting in a chair with your knees wide enough apart to drive a truck between them, slouching when you stand, moving in jerky motions, gawking, and all of that makes you look more like someone brought up by the uneducated, unsophisticated people of low quality. That's not true. I was brought up by good people, decent people who cared. And then why don't you try to make them proud of you? Proud of what you can become and proud of now who you are, she retorted before I could continue my protest. I swallowed back my pride and indignation. I will be only as good a teacher as you permit me to be, and you will only be as good a student as you allow yourself to be. Shall we begin, or for the next hour would you rather us debate on what you need help with or not? She asked firmly, never relaxing her proper posture or letting any warmth into her cold brown eyes. I'll try, I finally said, breathing deeply, determined not to cry. Good, then let's begin. Walk out and walk in again, pretending we are meeting for the first time. Keep thinking about your posture as you enter the room. I rose and left the parlor. For a moment I was tempted to rush out the front door. Then I gazed down at the corridor and saw Grandma Olivia watching me. I knew the satisfaction she would get from seeing me flee. She would just nod and say she knew I didn't have it in me to rise to her level. Furious at the thought of her ridicule, I pulled back my shoulders, head held high, and returned to the parlor. Miss Burton offered me her hand. I took it firmly and said, "Hello, Miss Burton. I'm pleased to meet you." She smiled and nodded toward the chair. I sat as she had instructed and placed my hands in my lap. "Very good," she said. "We'll make a lady out of you yet." I think being a lady comes more from knowing how to say hello, I told her. Of course it does, my dear. The guiding principle of etiquette is thoughtfulness. There are 10 commandments of everyday behavior. Never, she began, wagging her long, thin, bony finger at me, talk only about yourself. Never gossip. Never ask personal questions or pry. Never intentionally embarrass anyone. Never stare or point at someone. Never chew gum with an open mouth or snap it or make bubbles. Never display affection in public, she said, pausing for a breath. From what I understand, that's the commandment young people of today violate often. I don't, I protested. She shook her head. You must become your own best critic, and to do that, you must not lie, especially to yourself. That's what happens when you lie to others. You end up lying to yourself. But didn't you just kiss someone right out there in this driveway recently? She asked. I sat, my mouth agape. Grandma Olivia told her about my kissing Carrie. Don't keep your mouth open like that. It's not only impolite, it's unbecoming. Kissing in public is showing affection. Wouldn't you agree? Let's move on, she said, standing. Today we want to concentrate on eating. Eating? Mealtime manners, my dear. Please follow me to the dining room. I rose and started toward the door. Always permit the older person to leave first, she instructed. Embarrassed, I stopped and allowed her to walk out first. Please come along, she said. There's no need to wait long behind me. I shook my head and followed her to the dining room, feeling like a puppy being housebroken. As we passed the stairway, I noticed Loretta standing in the shadows, gazing down at me. Her face was shrouded in gloom, and I could only wonder whether Loretta would turn out to be my only friend in this cold, heartless home, or would she too prove to be another one of Grandma Olivia's minions, too frightened to do anything but her bidding. If only I knew I could trust Loretta, I would reach out to her and tell her to watch out closely. I was about to beat Grandma Olivia at her own game. My first opportunity came at dinner that night. As I was headed toward the dining room, I heard the voices in the parlor and paused by the doorway in time to hear Grandma Olivia say, "He's become impossible, a blithering idiot. I can't permit him to be seen in public anymore. I want you to call in some favors and put him at the head of the list, Nelson." "But I thought the doctor said he might just only exaggerate his condition," Judge Childs replied. "What about my condition? Don't you think it's been more than exasperating for me?" I stepped forward and the judge saw me. "Oh, Melanie," he exclaimed, getting up to greet me. I held out my hand the way Miss Burton had instructed, standing erect and holding out my arm firmly and stiffly to prevent him from embracing me. I was uncomfortable with him showing me any affection in front of Grandma Olivia. I knew that if she expected the relationship I was developing with my grandfather, she would destroy it as quickly as she had my fragile bond with Grandma Belinda. "Good evening, Judge Childs," I said. "It's nice to see you again." He paused as if struck dumb for a moment, then smiled and took my hand for a very quick greeting, glancing at Grandma Olivia as he did so. She nodded approvingly. "I'm happy to see you've come back." "Thank you," I said with a tight smile, hoping he would go along with my ploy. We were just relaxing before dinner," he explained with some awkwardness. He looked as dapper as ever, albeit a little older, grayer in his face and a bit thinner. He wore a navy sports jacket and khaki pants and a striped cravat tie loosely around his neck. "Isn't Grandpa Samuel coming for dinner?" I asked. "I haven't seen him all day." "No," Grandma Olivia said sharply. "His condition is worse. The doctor will be seeing him in the morning." "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked, wishing I could will Grandpa Samuel well again. "There's nothing any of us can do," she replied dryly. Just then Loretta came to the doorway with a small curtsy and announced dinner was ready. "Finally," Grandma said, rising. Judge Childs held out his arm and she took it quickly, the both of them heading for the doorway. I stepped aside to let them leave first and quickly followed down the corridor. "You must tell me about your trip west," the judge said as we were at the sitting table. "Perhaps you can come by one day and visit," he added, after throwing a nervous glance at Grandma Olivia. "I'd like that, Judge Childs," I said, unfolding my napkin and placing it in my lap. Grandma Olivia studied my posture as I sat straight, my spine pressed firmly against the back of my chair. As soon as the soup was served and Grandma Olivia picked up her spoon, the judge and I began to eat. Except for Grandma Olivia's house, I had never eaten anywhere. There had been so many pieces of silverware next to the plate. Miss Burton had explained to me, we always start with the implement of each type that is furthest from the plate. We ate quietly for a moment, Grandma Olivia and I eyeing each other. When the level of our soup became too low for the spoon, Grandma Olivia scraped at the bottom of her soup dish loud enough to be heard. I tipped mine, lifting the near edge and pointing the bowl away from myself. "I believe this is the proper way to do it, Grandma," I said, delighted to see her face redden. The judge started to laugh, but stopped at the moment he saw the rage in Grandma Olivia's eyes. "I know the way to do it. I wasn't ready yet," she replied. "Your spoon sounded as if you were," I said. Although I was determined to see my plan through, I was beginning to think I might have to take things a bit slower. She pressed her lips together and tilted her bowl properly, but she took one more spoonful. When we both finished our spoons in the soup dish, moving almost simultaneously and looking like two competitors vying for the prize in mealtime etiquette, I saw the question marks in the judge's eyes. Trying not to grin, Loretta removed the dishes and returned with our appetizers. Clams on the half shell. I assume you visited with Sarah and the children since your return, the judge said. How are they doing? As best as can be expected. Carrie and May really miss their dad, and of course Aunt Sarah is just so sad, I replied. Please give Sarah my best when you see her again, he said. I'll have to do something to help that poor family, he added, shaking his head softly. When Grandma Olivia began to eat her clams, the judge and I dug into ours. The clams were served on cracked ice, arranged around the containers of cocktail sauce. We smeared the clams with our shellfish forks and dipped them into the sauce and ate them in one bite. Sweet, the judge said, putting his belly contently. Our salads followed, and then the entree, which tonight was lamb chops. I always choked on my meal when the judge took one of the bone and gnawed at the meat. I could only imagine what Miss Burton would say to that. Grandma and I cut ours daintily and ate in small bites. When I was finished, I put my knife and fork on the plate and sat back. Loretta took my dish and silverware, and she collected Grandma Olivia's. The judge didn't relinquish until every morsel was gone, and he smacked his lips and remarked about the flavor of the meat. This is one of the best restaurants in Providence Town, he quipped. And the price is right, Grandma Olivia muttered. The judge roared with laughter and then sat forward with his elbows on the table, and he clasped his hands. So, Melanie, you're about to start your senior year, then, he said. I bet you're excited about that. Yes, I am, I replied honestly. I'm thinking of Rosewood for her as a prep school, Grandma Olivia said, always anxious to put in her 2 cents worth. Oh, yes, fine place. I think the Congressman Dunlap's daughter is there this year, if I'm not mistaken. You're not, Grandma Olivia said. Loretta brought in our coffee and lemon cake, which the judge eyed covetously. When Grandma Olivia lifted her cup and spilled some of her coffee into the saucer, it was as if a solo performer at a concert had hit a sour note. She froze for a moment, then continued sipping her coffee, and then put the cup back, her attention shifting to the lemon cake. Shouldn't you replace that saucer, Grandma? I asked her. She fired a look at me and sat back. Loretta, she called. Loretta appeared. I'd like a new saucer, please. Right away, Miss Logan, Loretta said and hurried back into the kitchen. The judge's smile widened. Grandma reached forward again for the lemon cake. She cut herself a piece and then passed the cake plate to the judge. I was told that the plate is to be passed counterclockwise, Grandma. Wasn't that correct? I asked, trying to sound as innocent as I could manage, considering my knees were knocking. Her face turned so purple so fast that I was worried she might do some actual harm to herself. She took the cake plate back so quickly, her hand trembled so much, and the cake slipped to the edge. In effort to balance it again, she overcompensated, and the cake fell, splattering in front of the judge, who pulled back to avoid being hit by icing. Whoops, he said with a laugh. Loretta came charging toward the table. Grandma Olivia, as red as a sunburnt tourist, jerked her chair away from the table to permit Laura full access to the mess. No harm done, the judge said. I'll eat it anyway. It looks... Loretta? She smiled at him, but shifted her eyes toward Grandma Olivia as if she felt she would somehow be held responsible. Nonsense, Grandma Olivia said. Loretta, take that back into the kitchen and make it look presentable again. Yes, ma'am, she said, hurrying away with the smashed cake. I would have eaten it off the table, the judge said, to lighten the moment. But Grandma Olivia glared daggers at him until he sat back like an obedient little boy. Then she turned slowly to me. If you hadn't interrupted like that. I was trying to practice what I've been taught, Grandma. I'm sorry. But Miss Burton says we shouldn't save our best manners for the outside world. She says it with people who live with deserve our best manners even more. Miss Burton, the judge asked. Someone I hired to teach her finer ways, Grandma quickly replied. Loretta returned with the cake somewhat prepared, only this time she went around the table and served each our piece. Looks scrumptious, doesn't it? The judge said. Yes, it does, I said, and I cut my piece with a fork. Grandma Olivia only nibbled at hers and left more than half on the plate. Just as Loretta returned to take away the dishes, we heard the doorbell. She paused for orders. See to that first, Loretta, Grandma said. Expecting someone, the judge asked. Not at all, she said, obviously annoyed to be disturbed. A moment later, Loretta returned with Carrie behind her. He was carrying a covered pie dish. Oh, sorry I got here too late, Grandma, he said, but Ma sent over this homemade cranberry pie. I picked some early berries and she made it just this afternoon. I've never cared much for cranberry pie, Grandma Olivia said, sniffing haughtily. I love it, the judge said, winking at me. Then you take it, she said, with a wave of her hand. Thank you. And Carrie, you thank your mother for me, he said, and Carrie stepped forward with the pie. Put that in a box for Judge Childs, Loretta, Grandma Olivia commanded. You should have brought it earlier if you expected us to eat it tonight, she told Carrie. I had some things to do at the dock, and don't worry about it, the judge said. It won't go to waste, that's for sure. Carrie stood there awkwardly, waiting for an invitation to sit at the table, but Grandma Olivia wasn't offering any. He glanced at me, then smiled at the judge. May I be excused, I said. I'd like to go for a walk on the beach. She glared icily at me. It's getting late, she said sternly. Late? The judge asked and looked at his watch as if he were the one who somehow mistook the time. For walks on the beach, she exclaimed. I thought you had problems at the dock, Carrie. It's been fixed, Grandma. I can stay for a short visit, he said, practically pleading. Reluctantly, she nodded. I rose. Thank you, Grandma, Judge Childs. I enjoyed dining with you tonight. I hope to see you soon. Anytime you want, my dear. Just come right over, he said, smiling happily. Thankfully, Grandma Olivia was too wrapped up in her own steam to think about the judge's invitation. I left the table and accompanied Carrie to the back door, where we stepped outside. I felt as if I'd thrown off the shackles. The night air never felt so refreshing. What's going on in there? Carrie asked. You could cut tension with a knife. Grandma and I are practicing good table manners, I said and laughed. It appears she's not as perfect as she thinks she is. I think I'm going to have some fun with all this, proper that. Carrie took my hand and we walked down to the beach. The ocean was calm, the tide lapping softly at the shore. In the distance, I saw tiny lights of a tanker. Stars glittered just above the water, some looking like strings of sparkling diamonds. There was no moonlight, but the evening was clear enough that the heavens glowed down over us. You sure you want to live with her? Carrie asked. She looked meaner than ever tonight. Where was my grandpa? After the whole pie thing, I was afraid to ask, he explained. She has him shut up in his room. I overheard her talking to the judge. I think she's getting Grandpa Samuel placed in the same home my grandmother's in now, I said. Is he that bad? Carrie asked, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. He's babbling confusing things. I don't understand. He's not looking after himself, Carrie. Unfortunately, I think she might be right. He needs help. It's like everything's falling apart around us, Carrie said sadly. Mom won't take a break out of her depression, and May is so unhappy. I'll come by tomorrow, I promise, and spend time with them. Thanks, I know they both miss you terribly. We paused, both gazing out at the ocean. He slipped his arms around my waist, and I leaned my head on his shoulder. I felt his lips on my hair, my forehead, and then on my temples. I lifted my head toward him, and we kissed. Then he embraced me and turned me toward him so we could kiss again. I love you, Melanie. I don't think an hour goes by that I don't think of you, even when I'm asleep, he said. Carrie, we have a problem, I said, pulling away and taking a few steps down to the beach. What? He asked, following me slowly. Grandma Olivia doesn't want us to spend so much time together. She's practically forbidden it. What? Why? She's planning out my life, designing it, her design. There's no place set aside for you, I told him, uncertain how to soften the blow. What? But, so I think it would be best if we don't let her know how much time we spend together. The less she knows about it, the better. She'll only make trouble for us and for you, I said. How can she do that? He asked worriedly. Any way she wants, in every way you don't want, I said. Why cause problems anyway if we don't have to? The more I see of the adult world, the more I realize it's built around millions of white lies that get strung into chains of illusion and deception anyway. I'm tired of fighting it, Carrie. If we have to steal our happiness, we'll steal it, I said firmly. He smiled. As long as I'm with you, I don't care how we do it, he said. For the time being, I'm going to let her believe that I'm doing everything she wants. It'll make things easier for all of us. Your mother doesn't need any more turmoil in her life at the moment, neither do either of us, I said. He nodded. You're getting to be a pretty strong person, Melanie. Whether I want to or not, I replied. He laughed and then we embraced each other. Carrie, I missed you so much, he said. When can we be together like we were? Soon, I promise, soon. We better get back though. He nodded reluctantly. As we approached the rear of the house, I gazed toward the basement stairs, recalling when Carrie had first shown me the pictures of my mother. Grandpa Samuel mumbled something about some other secrets hidden in the basement, Carrie. Do you think it's true, or is it just illusion talking? I'm sure that's all it was, Carrie said. But as we passed the stairway, I felt the shadows drawing me, beckoning me, promising revelations that would chill me to the bones. Someday I would have the courage to see, but for now, I needed my courage just to make it through the day.